Hey everyone, just doing a little testing of some equipment and some different stuff here today, and thought we would do a live stream of reading part of Alexander Campbell's book on hermeneutics. So we're going to attempt to do this without we'll see how this goes. Sometimes you just don't have as much computer as you need to do the things you think you need to do, or at least the things that the computer thinks you need to do. So it seems to have settled down, and we'll get started. This is Principles of Bible Interpretation by Alexander Campbell, in 1835. Principles of Interpretation. Written revelation. The whole Christian religion, its facts, its doctrine, its promises, its threatenings, is presented to the world in a written record. The writings of prophets and apostles contain all the divine and supernatural knowledge in the world. Now, unless these sacred writings can be certainly interpreted, the Christian religion never can be certainly understood. Every argument that demonstrates the necessity of such a written document as the Bible equally demonstrates the necessity of fixed and certain principles or rules of interpretation. For without the latter, the former is of no value whatever to the world. All the differences in the religious opinion and sentiment amongst those who acknowledge the Bible are occasioned by false principles of interpretation, or by a misapplication of the true principles. There is no law nor standard, literary, moral, or religious, that can coerce human thought or action by only promulgating and acknowledging it. If a law can affect anything, our actions must be conformed to it. Were all students of the Bible taught to apply the same rules of interpretation to its pages, there would be a greater uniformity of in opinion and sentiment than ever resulted from the simple adoption of any written creed. Great unanimity has we're going to try that one more time. Great unanimity has obtained in some of the sciences in consequences of the adoption of certain rules of analysis and synthesis. For all who work by the same rules come to the same conclusions. And may it not be possible that in this divine science of religion there may yet be a very great degree of unanimity of sentiment and uniformity of practice amongst all its friends? Is the school of Christ the only school in which there can be no unanimity, no proficiency in knowledge? Is the book of God the only volume which can never be understood alike by those who read and study it? It cannot be supposed, but by dishonoring God, for as all the children of God are taught by God, if they are necessarily unintelligent in his oracles and discordant in their views, the deficiencies must rather be imputed to the teacher than to the taught. For the pupils in this school can be taught other sciences in other schools with such uniformity and harmony of views as to make it manifest to all that they are the disciples of one teacher. God's book is, however, put into the hands of men, as it was first spoken to men, but they have, by some unpropitious cause, by some unpropitious cause, been taught not to receive it from God, but from men. They do not consider that the written book, as well as the spoken word, is tendered to us under the stipulations of human language, according to the contract between man and man, touching the value and or meaning of currency of thought, that every word and sentence is to be weighed and tested by the constitutional laws and standards of the currency of ideas. When one person addresses another, he supposes the person addressed competent to interpret his words, and therefore all wise and benevolent men select such words and phrases as in their judgment can be interpreted by those addressed. Every speaker proceeds in all his communications upon the principle that his hearer is an interpreter, that he has not first to be taught the science of interpretation, and that he is bound so to express himself that his hearer may interpret and understand his words, by an art which is supposed to be native, which is indeed universal, common to all nations, barbarous as well as civilized. Now, as God is infinitely wise and benevolent in all his oral communications to men, he proceeded upon the principle that they were, by this native art, competent interpreters of his expressions, for otherwise his addresses could be of no value. He could not even begin to teach them a new art of interpretation as respected his communications, but by using their own words in the stipulated sense, unless we imagine a miracle in every case and suppose that all his words were to be understood by a miraculous interpretation. Words were to be, and this idea, let's go back. Unless we imagine a miracle in every case and suppose that all his words were to be understood by a miraculous interpretation. And this idea, if carried out, would make a verbal revelation of no value whatever to the children of men. If human language had never been confounded, if a multitude of different dialects had not been introduced, no occasion for translating language, as a matter of course, would have ever existed. Again, if words and phrases and the manners and customs of mankind were unchangeably fixed, or universally the same at all times and in all countries, the art of interpreting would have been still more simple than it is. For so far it is as it is artificial, it is owing to the different dialects, idioms, manners, customs, and all the varieties which the ever-changing conditions of the society have originated and are still originating. At present, however, we would only impress upon the mind of the reader that the very fact that we have a written revelation, that this revelation was first spoken, then written, supposes that there is somewhere a native or an acquired art of interpretation, that the persons addressed were already in possession of that art, for without such an understanding there would have been neither wisdom nor benevolence in giving to mankind any verbal communication from God. To unfold the principles of this art, whether we may regard it as native or acquired, and to deduce from those principles some plain precepts, is the object of the first part of this book. For as before observed, unless the sacred writings can be certainly interpreted, the Christian religion never can be certainly understood. Let's go back. For as before observed, unless the sacred writings can be certainly interpreted, the Christian religion never can be certainly understood. We can only add that we will not assume a principle, nor suggest a precept of interpretation that is not sustained by all the masters of this science, whose judgment is regarded and whose decisions are acquiesced in by all the authorities in the Republic of Letters. This has been Chapter 1 of The Principles of Bible Interpretation by Alexander Campbell. The point that Campbell makes, and the point that is absolutely valid in this, is that if anyone at any time in history ever understood the Bible, it was because they first had the ability to interpret plain speaking, to interpret knowledge, to gain knowledge from spoken word and then from written word. If it is the case that someone in time had that ability, and it's likely the case that we still have that ability, as I'm still talking and you're still listening, then it's the case that we can apply the principles of understanding, the principles of interpreting speech and language rightly and properly to God's Word. And that when we use the correct principles of interpretation, when we use the correct principles of understanding, we will come to the same conclusions about the Scriptures. Now, that's not to say that every aspect of thought and understanding about the Scriptures will be completely identical. We're not drones. But the idea is that God could express His will, His desires, and His intent through His words in human language, and we not only can understand them alike, but we are also accountable to them. We're responsible to them. We will be held in judgment based upon the words that He spoke. Jesus said, "By my words you will be judged." So this is something that's important. This is something that's essential for us to understand. Anytime we're studying the Bible, we have knowledge and understanding about principles of interpretation, and we must properly apply them. We must use them, and we must strive to interpret the Bible as God intended us to understand it, because there was an intent for it to be understood. So many times throughout Scriptures you see the examples of the Scriptures where God wanted a message conveyed. That may have been to Old Testament Israel. God wanted a certain prophet to convey a certain message at a certain time, and He expected the person who heard the message to be able to understand it and to be able to obey it. If God can expect that of Old Testament Israel, can't He expect that of us today? This has been just a few thoughts on this chapter from Principles of Bible Interpretation by Alexander Campbell. Thank you for joining.